Okay, welcome back to Wrestling Travels Lockdown Sessions, presented as always by our boys over at True Heel Heat over in New York City, and also by Stu's Wrestling Podcast. I got to thank Stu for hooking me up with today's guest, who I'm super excited to talk to. But Mr. Del Wilkes. Del, welcome to the show.
Man, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate you reaching out to me and inviting me to be a part of this, man. Good to see you.
Great to see you too, man. I have so many questions, so I'm gonna jump right into it. But I want to jump in really early. Offensive lineman at South Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man, that's awesome. And the Gamecocks, of course. I know some of our British fans here, when I say football, they're gonna think soccer, but we're talking about the real football, the real sport.
Yep.
So you played offensive line.
Yep.
South Carolina. Now, here's where I differ from everybody else that does a podcast, Del. Everybody else has this journalistic integrity where they research and do all kinds of stuff. I jumped on Wikipedia, and just because I know your wrestling career, but I'm backing up. So you had a couple tryouts with a couple different teams, right, after your college career?
I did. I'm born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina, with the exception of 5 years of my life from when I was 11 to 16. Those 5 years, my dad had moved our family to Georgia, but with the exception of those 5 years, I've been in Columbia, South Carolina my entire life. Grew up in a home, not so much my dad, but my dad's dad, my dad's brothers were all big sports fans, and they were all University of South Carolina Gamecock sports fans, especially football. So I grew up in a background that I was taught Gamecock football and the history of it. And I was a kid that was big athletics. So I got involved in football at an early age, had an opportunity to really go anywhere I wanted to go to play college football. But in the end, the hometown team got my services. So in 1980, I entered the University of South Carolina on a football scholarship and had a great career. In 1980, I got to block for a Heisman Trophy winner, George Rogers. And then in 84, my senior year, I was part of the first team in school history to win 10 games. And I was the captain and most valuable player on that team. I'll pat myself on the back a little. I'm one of only 4 consensus All-Americans in school history and the most decorated offensive lineman in school history. So had a good career there. That did not translate into an NFL career, though. I had a couple of tryouts. 85, I was in camp with the Buccaneers. In 86, they traded me to the Falcons. And then at the end of camp in 86, after the last preseason game, as the Falcons were getting ready to whittle down to their opening roster, I was released. And at that point, put football in the rearview mirror and went straight ahead into a pro wrestling career, or on the trail of a pro wrestling career.
Right. So that now, according to my who you trained with up with Vern Gagne, is that correct?
Well, I actually started my training process here in my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina, in a little bit of an unorthodox way. I went to a school that was owned and operated by, at that time, the most famous lady wrestler ever, the fabulous Moolah, Lillian Ellison. And Lillian's school had never produced a guy that went on to have any success. There had been a lot of girls that had come out of Lillian's school that had wonderful careers, but I was the only guy that ever came out of her school that had any success. Later, when I got up to Minneapolis and I was renting a room from Brad Ringens, who was working for Vern at the time, I did a little bit of training with Brad, but most of my stuff was done in Lillian's school here in Columbia.
Again, Wikipedia leads me astray, but that's okay, because I was wondering as I'm doing this, looking up, I'm like, from Columbia, South Carolina, all the way up to Minneapolis, up in our neck of the woods. I was like, well, there's got to be a stop along the way, and there you go, training with the fabulous Moolah. So yep. And everybody that knows me knows I grew up on AWA. And I still go back and love to watch the old school. But you came in as the Trooper, I remember, on TV, and you left a really big impression on me, because at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, of course, the AWA lasted until '91, and I know I went to a couple spot shows that Vern ran after that. But you came in as the Trooper, and you were a beast immediately. On TV, at least, we started seeing you come in, and you went to the time limit. I remember with the champion at that time, Larry Zbyszko.
Yeah.
I remember you writing tickets in the ring and stuff. So can you talk to me about the development of the Trooper character, or how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, when the way I got up there was working one of Moolah's local shows here in Columbia. Wahoo was working for Vern at the time, Wahoo McDaniel. Wahoo had a permanent home in Charlotte, and Vern had closed down for a few weeks, and Wahoo had come back to Charlotte to hang out for a while, and Lillian had him work one of her shows, which I was on the card here in Columbia, and I met Wahoo, and it was through Wahoo that I met Vern and Greg. So once Vern opened back up and started running again, Wahoo was back in Minneapolis. He told Vern about me. He told Greg about me. And I got a call from Wahoo one day, and he said, "Pack your bags, come to Minneapolis. You got a job." Now, when I got there, I was working as Del Wilkes. The way the Trooper thing came about is one of the guys that worked for Moolah when she ran shows on the weekend, and one of the guys that sort of helped train me, his real job, his 9-to-5 job, he was a deputy sheriff in one of the neighboring counties next to where I live. Well, when he worked these shows for Moolah, he just did an extension of his real life job. He worked the shows as the super enforcer, a cop gimmick. He already had the gimmick. That's what he did for a living. So he would just put on his cop uniform and wrestle these shows. And when I got to Minneapolis, he called me up one day and asked me, he said, "Man, if I send you a tape of some of my matches, would you show it to Wahoo, Vern, and Greg?" I said, "Sure, man. The guy's been good and helping me out." So he sent me the tape. I passed it on to Wahoo, who passed it on to Greg and Vern. And they contacted me and said, "Look, that guy needs to keep doing what he's doing for a living. He needs to keep writing tickets and putting people in jail. He's obviously a good cop, but he's not a good wrestler. But we do like the idea of a character like that for you. Be at the office tomorrow. We're going to run this by you." So when I showed up at the office the next day, that's when they laid out the idea of the Trooper for me.
Yeah, I mean, just some of the things I remember. The writing the tickets, the big pinch.
Yeah, the big pinch. Yeah, sort of a goofy finish, but I was, I was young, I was green, and I was willing to listen, eager to do whatever they told me to do and advised me to do. And so, yeah, the big pinch was my finish. And thankfully, I got to work some with Zbyszko, and he was able just to lead me through some matches with him, that time limit match that you're talking about that was on ESPN. I tell you, man, and you know this with you being a fan of the business and knowing the AWA like you do, the AWA was really drawing its last breath when I got there. They were struggling. What was once a mighty, mighty territory was really just a struggling TV company. And we were on ESPN 5 days a week, Monday through Friday from 4 to 5 o'clock. But outside of that, that's about all they had going for them at the time.
Right. And you, I want to ask you about your tag team partner. You guys were the last ones to hold the AWA belts at the time. And he unfortunately passed away. But do you got any DJ Peterson stories you could lay out me?
Unfortunately, I really don't. I got to know DJ. But like I said, about all we did for Vern at that time, we worked a few spot shows occasionally, but it really was just a TV company. I finally left and came back to Columbia, and they would just fly me up for TV. We were doing our TV tapings in Rochester, Minnesota. So I would fly up for a weekend, we'd tape TV, and I'd come back home. So I really never got a chance to spend time out on the road with DJ, doing the towns and running the roads, because they weren't doing that then. It just wasn't really a functional territory. It was just, we just basically taped TV, and that was it. But I can tell you this, DJ was a great guy. He was a talented guy, a guy that had been in the business longer than me and helped me out. But like you said, unfortunately, he lost his life in a motorcycle accident not long after the company closed its doors.
Yeah, and back at that time, that was before the internet and everything. So when I learned of that, it was well after they had passed away, and it was something that still it's hard to imagine, because, man, I tell you what, I in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. I'm still back in my hometown. I didn't even get ESPN. I got the weekly TV show. So, but I looking so forward to that, and I remember VHS tapes of the AWA that I still have, that I just watched and rewatched, and but at that time I knew, you kind of felt like something was going on, because the AWA was on its normal time slot, and then sometimes for a couple of weeks it wasn't on, so it was getting tougher as a young kid for me to find. So I that's why your character sticks out so much to me, because that was I'm hoping that they hold on at that time. And you were in there with and granted, these stories might not be able to come through now because you just explained it. You flew in and out, but Yokozuna was in there as Kakina Maximus. You had did you work a lot with Eric Bischoff at that time, or what was his role?
Eric was the guy that did our TV show. He was the voice of the AWA at the time. And so that's where I met Eric, in which later down the road, when Eric was running WCW, led to me going to work for WCW. Also, the fact that Greg Gagne was working in WCW at that time as well. But yeah, that's when I first met Bischoff. And I worked a couple of matches with Yokozuna, a pre-Yokozuna character. And of course, also John Nord was there, Scott Norton was there, the Destruction Crew, Wayne Bloom and Mike Enos. Zabisco, Slaughter came in for some shows. Also Nikita Koloff. So I did some six-mans with Slaughter and Nikita. So there was talent, but basically we just flew in and out, taped TV, and went back home.
That's the thing. When I look back on it, like, I take a lot of heat to this day about AWA, but I'm like, I tell everybody, go watch it. There is talent.
Absolutely.
There's and not just from 83 and 84 when they poached like Hulk Hogan and Jesse and Bobby, but all the way up till the end. And then I even remember I went to college, played football over in River Falls, went to a couple spot shows after they had closed, and saw Wahoo, Larry, Tito Santana, Candy Divine. They were still, and I was, man, I tell you what, the only disappointment that I have is, WWE bought all the library of tapes. And of course, I subscribe to their network, and there's not a lot of AWA stuff on there. So I'm always looking to find. Every time I go to a show, Del, I'm looking to see if somebody's selling some bootleg DVDs of AWA stuff, and it's hard to come across. But it's so enjoyable.
It is hard to find, and I tell you, I felt for Vern, even though I was young in the business. I was, had enough sense to realize that this was a proud man that once. Looked over and ran one of the best territories in the country. Of course, so many great talented guys came out of and went on to do well in other companies as well. But man, they did their best. There was always this big deal right around the corner. It was Viacom, or it was somebody else that was going to drop a bunch of cash into the AWA and sort of reboot it and give it another start. But unfortunately, it just never happened. Just never happened.
From and I always tell people, Greg Gagne, everybody's like, who's your favorite wrestler? And I take a bunch of heat about Greg Gagne because people like he wasn't flashy. But when I was a kid, I turned on the TV and there's Greg Gagne and Sergeant Slaughter right after the High Flyers, and it sticks with you. What I'm wondering is, before you got into professional wrestling, obviously, did you see it on TV? Did you see anybody on TV that when you were wrestling, before you're wrestling, that you're like, hey, I like that guy? He's somebody. There's got to be somebody in the South.
Absolutely. Growing up here in South Carolina, when I was a younger boy, we got Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling with Bob Caudle. And so I grew up watching the Briscoe brothers. And of course, I'd see Wahoo. And then we would get Florida Championship Wrestling on Saturday nights. And of course, Dusty and all those guys. But man, when I was a kid, the very first live match I ever attended here in my hometown of Columbia, the only thing I remember is the main event. I was 10 years old, and it was Rip Hawk and Sweet Hansen against Jack and Jerry Briscoe. And I thought the Briscoe brothers, especially Jack, man, that was John Wayne, in my opinion. There wasn't a tougher guy. I mean, Jack was my hero, man, as a kid. I just idolized Jack Briscoe.
Oh, it's great to hear those old names. I always talk about not just the old names that, you know, are gone and retired, but a lot of the moves. Um, and I know I don't want to get off on a tangent on today's wrestling because it's a different animal. It's a lot of
Yep.
high spots and everything. But I always, when I get a chance to talk old school wrestling, like I miss seeing the abdominal stretch, the surfboard, and then some of the Russian leg sweep and stuff that were just staples when we were a kid. And I'm like, man, I know somebody today could come back and could almost have like an old school gimmick, and I think it would get over. In fact, I don't know how much you keep up with the current product, but it was a couple weeks ago. Everybody's ranting and raving over NXT UK, Walter versus Ilya Dragunov, I think his name is. And people are going nuts on the internet. And I go, that was old school wrestling is what it was. You just haven't seen it. You know?
Well, I don't keep up with the current product, but to go back and touch on a couple of things you mentioned, just some of those old school moves. Watching Mid-Atlantic when I was a kid, I would see Abe Jacobs do the Kiwi roll. And you mentioned Greg Gagne. Listen, I think Greg is one of the most underrated workers ever. I really do. Greg had everything a babyface needed to have. Greg could talk, Greg could work, and Greg had great babyface fire. You talk about a comeback, and I tell you this, not to drop names, but to literally sort of validate your opinion about Greg. I did Steve Austin's podcast a couple of times, and talking with Steve on his podcast, and even before we were recording the podcast, Steve put Greg over like $1 million, and he was talking about Greg's ability to sell and Greg's ability when he's firing a comeback. I mean, to show that fire and that passion, man. Greg did that as good as anybody. Greg was a tremendous worker that is greatly, greatly underappreciated.
100%. I'm so glad to hear you say that because, you know, I talked with one of the earlier guests I had on was Frankie DeFalco, wrestler up here in Wisconsin. And Frankie says, I talk to Greg every week. And I'm like, dude, please put me over to Greg because I would love just to talk to Greg. I met Greg as a kid growing up at house shows and had his autograph and everything. And it was just, there's that Gagne fire, they used to say at Rod Trongard, you know, he'd come out. And if I think about it now, being in the business, going, he had everything. That's why I was drawn to him, because he could take that babyface pounding and come back. And his matches with Kurt Hennig, chasing that title around, the Gagnes versus the Hennig, I mean, he was just always there for me. And I'm going to be totally validated when people watch this, because I take a lot of heat and I take it proudly. Oh, you like Greg? Yeah, I love him. You know,
I'm glad you do, because you know, I consider Greg a friend, and he and Vern had a huge impact on helping me in my career and opening some doors for me. And I totally agree with you. Greg could go. He could go, man. He was a great worker, and he knew the business. Obviously, he knew it well. He learned it from one of the greatest ever. And they developed some tremendous talent that was up there. You think about the guys that came out of Vern's school, that came out of that territory, some of the biggest names in the history of the business. So obviously they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the coolest moments of my life was, it seems like forever ago, but it was just last November in Baltimore, Wrestling Travel. We were there at the AEW show, and they brought in a bunch of legends. And I'm supposed to be working our table. I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I walk by Ronnie Garvin sitting at a table and nobody's there. And I start talking to him about, you know, I go right to Greg Gagne, because they had a little bit of feud when Ronnie was there for a cup of coffee. And he said that Greg came down and worked him down in the South. And Ron said, I would have come up earlier if it wasn't for the cold. That's the typical Minneapolis thing. But he said that he and Greg had so many matches that down South that weren't on film that I would have just been impressed with. So it's so nice to hear Greg. Not that Greg needs any validation from me or anything, but it's nice to hear everybody say things. So hopefully Greg will see one of these interviews and go, hey, I'll talk to that guy. So
I hope so, man. Hope so.
You go on to the global wrestling after AWA?
I did. Yes, I sure did. That was the next step for me.
Next step. And how global was just, you're kind of there for a couple of years before you go with NWA, WCW, right?
Well, actually, I was there at the beginning. Quick story. Once the AWA had folded up, I started hearing rumblings that there was going to be a company that Joe Pedicino was trying to get started. There was going to be this guy, this African businessman that was going to dump tens of millions of dollars into this upstart company called the Global Wrestling Federation. And that guy never came through. Don't know if he existed or not, but it never materialized with this rich African gentleman. But there was a lady in Atlanta, Georgia, that came up with money and that had done very well in the real estate business and backed the Global Wrestling Federation. So I got a call from Joe one day, and he said, listen, man, we're getting started up in a couple of weeks. We're going to tape all our shows at the Sportatorium in Dallas. We're going to call it the Global Dome. We're going to be on the ESPN, the same time spot that you were with the AWA, 4 to 5 o'clock, Monday through Friday, and we want you to be a part of it. So when I got my FedEx package for my tickets to fly out to Dallas for the very first global TV taping, I took my trooper gear because nobody told me anything different. I thought I was going to be working as the trooper. Well, we check into the hotel, and all the talent stayed at the same hotel, about a 20-minute ride from the Sportatorium. And earlier that afternoon, Joe called my motel room. Joe stayed at the same motel, he and his wife, Bonnie Blackstone. And he said, I need you to walk over to my room. He said, I'm here with Bill Eady, who was helping book things in Global, and we've got an idea for you tonight. So I walked over, and they laid out the Trooper idea. The Patriot, I'm sorry. Bonnie had an old-fashioned brown paper grocery bag rolled up, and she unrolled it, and she reached in, pulled out this red, white, and blue mask, red, white, and blue tights, red, white, and blue trunks, and said, we think that wrestling needs a patriotic character because at that time, George H.W. Bush had sent our military into Kuwait to liberate Kuwait when Iraq had occupied Kuwait. So patriotism was really at a high level. And they said, we need to take advantage of where patriotism is right now. And we think you're the guy that can pull it off. Here's the character. It's called the Patriot. Here's the gear. What do you think? And I said, I'm in. Let's do it. So literally just a few hours before the very first TV taping for the GWF, I found out that I was going to be working as the Patriot.
Yeah, and at that time, I remember on the news, we had the Patriot missiles, the Scud missiles were the enemy. Yeah. And, man, I got to tell you, when this pandemic ends and I get a little more economic trickle down in my pocket, I got to get a hold of one of those masks, one of the coolest masks that ever with the red, white, and blue and the gold trim.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. A quick story about that. They gave me the first mask, and it was thick. It didn't stretch very well. It didn't breathe very well. It was really just bothersome. And it wasn't long after I started having success in Global that Baba called me up and invited me to come work in All Japan. And my very first tour in All Japan, a 16-year-old kid approached me one day in the lobby of a hotel in Tokyo, Japan, introduced himself, spoke very little English, and asked if he could make a mask for me. And I said, sure. About 2 weeks later, when we were back in Tokyo, he showed up with that mask. And after that point, he made all of my masks, the many different color schemes, did a wonderful job, never charged me for anything, and went on to have a wonderful business that still thrives to this day. He makes all of Rey Mysterio's stuff. He always has. He makes wrestling gear for guys in Japan, guys all across Mexico. But I was the first one he ever made anything for. And I have to give him all the credit for those wonderful designs and different color combinations on those masks. That guy, he did a wonderful job.
Yeah, like I said, they stick out today as a beautiful, beautiful mask. Now, is there any, if I get into your mindset at that time, do you have any hesitation about hiding your face at all? Or are you just like, hey, I'll do what I got to do?
No, I was eager. I wanted to have a career as a professional wrestler. As a kid, there were two things I dreamed of doing. One was playing football at the University of South Carolina, and that dream had come true. And the other one was I wanted to be a professional wrestler. It bit me. That bug bit me that night as a 10-year-old when I watched Jackie and Jerry take on Rip and Swede. And I was willing to do whatever I needed to do to advance my career and to become a name in the business. When they told me they thought I would be the perfect fit for that mask, I had no hesitation, man. None whatsoever.
Yeah, and people are gonna be mad, but I got to be respectful of Dell's time. And when you host the show, you can ask Dell all kinds of crazy WWE questions and stuff. But I just want to touch on stuff real quick, and I want to be respectful of your time. But you go on to I think, 2-time WCW Tag Team Champion. Am I right, or one time?
Twice with me and Marcus Bagwell, Stars and Stripes.
Absolutely, and I love that. Was when I, as I'm growing up, I'm as dumb as everybody else without the internet, so I don't put the Trooper and the Patriot in the same category. I'm like, oh, I got the Trooper, and now there's other guy, the Patriot, and then you have what I think, and I know everybody's going on record, but when you go to the WWE, WWF at the time, you show up, you're this breath of fresh air, and it just, I don't know, I feel like they could have used you a little bit better, but that's none of my business. Like you said, you're in there, you're doing whatever you can for the business. But how long were you? WWE career was how long?
It didn't last long, and I'll tell you exactly what happened there. I started, I worked for Baba on 2 different occasions. For probably a total of maybe 5 years that I worked for Baba. And it was just a different style of wrestling there. It was more physical. Anybody can go back and watch anything from All Japan Pro Wrestling in the 90s, and I challenge you to find anything better. The greatest matches, the most 5-star matches I've ever seen. It was an unbelievable roster of talent on both the Japanese side and the American side. And but it was a more physical style of wrestling, and my body took a beating, and it was starting to wear down. And I had some very severe injuries. Had a very severe knee injury and a very severe tricep injury, and I'd never had them taken care of. And by the time it gets to 97, and I have a sit down with Vince, set up through Jim Ross and Bruce Pritchard and Jim Cornette, guys that were allies of mine there, and Vince offers me a 3-year deal. I knew when I signed the contract, dude, that I wasn't going to be there long. My body was shot. It wasn't that Vince didn't use me right. My body let me down. My body would not allow me to go on any further. And it was during that feud with Bret Hart that I could not continue to go. My body just literally, I've had 17 surgeries since then due to those injuries that I had when I got to work for Vince. So when I signed that 3-year deal, there was no visions of grandeur in my mind that I would be able to fulfill the 3 years. I knew I was on borrowed time when I got there physically.
That kind of makes everything kind of makes sense. Now, I want to thank you for the time. I want to ask the last question I always ask people is how can the fans follow you? Do you have merch? Yes. I imagine you still have merch for sale. But my question before I ask you that question is, I'm sure you have Patriot merch for sale, but is there Trooper merch that exists?
There's not. I personally have a couple of Trooper T-shirts that we used to sell, but those aren't for sale. I'm holding on to those for, just the sake of saving them and passing them down to my kids and grandkids. But there is Patriot merchandise, and it's at my website, Dell, and that's DEL, DellThePatriotWilkes.com. There are masks. Had a documentary come out several years back. There's T-shirts, masks, pictures, cards, and things of that nature that you can get at DellThePatriotWilkes.com. Also, you can follow me on Facebook, Del Wilkes, and on Twitter, at Del Wilkes, all capital letters, at Del Wilkes. And also, too, every Sunday night, Facebook Live, I have my own podcast now that I co-host with Avi Klein. It's called Unmasking the Truth, every Sunday night at 8 o'clock. Facebook Live, also on Twitch as well.
Very cool, man. You are all over. That's awesome. It's so good to I've caught this stuff with Avi Klein before, and he's doing a lot with everybody. So to me, he came out of nowhere, and I see he does a lot with our friend Bill DeMott.
Yeah, there are several of us that are teammates now, and we worked under the umbrella of Wrestling with Anything But. There's Ray Lloyd, myself, Bill DeMott, Paul Roma, Mike Drosy, Duke the Dumpster Drosy, and Don Morocco. And we all have our own podcast that we co-host with Avi Klein. So Avi's on the podcast 7 days a week, and it's all under the umbrella of Wrestling with Anything But they're all on Facebook Live, and Unmasking the Truth is Sunday nights at 8 o'clock.
That's awesome. Yeah, so any fans, you got to check these guys out on Facebook. It's very interesting. You know, some of the names that you don't. What I think is cool is there are guys that kind of oversaturate, but then there's guys like you who are like, hey, I want to hear. Like when I saw he had Don Morocco on, I'm like, oh my goodness. Here's my AWA-ness. Don Morocco was so great in WWF, but when he came to AWA for that cup of coffee, I was like, man, we got somebody. Vern would have hired me if I was old enough at the time, just because I was such a, hey, what can we do for AWA? So Del, I cannot thank you enough for spending a few minutes with us. We'll get this out. We're gonna share this on Twitter, but Wrestling Travel, big supporters of yours. Even though most of them are from the United Kingdom, we consider ourselves Patriot fans. So I want to thank you for your time.
Man. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on, brother. Enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, Dale.
Thank you, man.